So
I threw! I'm so sad.
Wait, the other one is still going.
Oh, fuck! Okay, welcome to our podcast. So we have 3 hosts today, and we're going to be talking about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, the famous novel. And my name is Ahan.
My name is Mateo.
And I'm Rishabh.
Yep, and we have a list of topics that we would like to cover for Frankenstein, and we kind of want to delve into the philosophical questions that kind of govern the novel. So I guess we'll get started with kind of the quintessential question of Frankenstein, let's call it. What exactly creates a monster? Right? He has human tendencies. So what exactly constitutes a monster in that sense?
I think the most important part, at least for a discussion that we want to have, is that a monster is something or someone that is considered by society as irredeemable, as having done something or being something that is not worth being treated with dignity.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I feel like there's so many competing perspectives about like what a monster actually really is, because I feel like a lot of people might say like a monster is kind of like a physical terror or like something abnormal to society. And I think adopting something more in the context of a society would be more compatible with the novel. So I think definitely going with Mateo's definition would be good.
Mm-hmm.
So, in addressing the question then, what really makes something a monster? How are monsters bred? I think it's first important to consider the Victorian society that the novel's written in. And the fact that this society was very perfectionist. People in the society focus on ideals that they wanted their friends, their family to have. And they did not accept pretty much anything in the public sphere that contrasted with the perfectionism that the British Empire was trying to convey at this time. And I think that need to keep the skeletons in the closet played out with Victor Frankenstein. He didn't tell his family about the monster and the trauma that came about because of it. And the lack of support and wisdom that he could get from the people close to him contributed to the monsters becoming a real monster, something that would kill people and harm people and would generally be considered an abomination.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. The people in the Victorian era, they're all stifled, right, by all these expectations, and especially the middle class, and all the etiquette that they had to follow. So I think that's a really interesting point, especially when you compare it to our current liberal society and how we kind of incorporate diversity into everything. And I was wondering if you guys had any ideas or thoughts on what would have happened if Frankenstein and his monster and the people around them, if they were transported into modern society. Like, how would that have changed Frankenstein and his monster's journey?
I think our culture of labeling, or rather not labeling because we want to be more inclusive, would definitely have had an impact. What do you think about that, Rishabh?
Yeah, I think that as a society, we always have this tendency to label people as monsters, ostracize them. They're others. And I think this is like even apparent when you see Victor's first reaction to creating the monster. He immediately chooses to like label his yellow skin and how it contrasted with his watery eyes or such. And kind of like directly putting him down because of his appearance. And I think, like, in this sense, society corrupts the monster. He's initially innocent to when he's first created, but I think that the more he kind of learns about society, the more he gets corrupted by the things around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are really good points. It's kind of interesting to think about, especially with the way our society currently functions.
I think another interesting point that contributes to monstrosity in the novel is how it features God complex, specifically in Victor Frankenstein. How he has the desire for greatness and the aspiration to break the boundaries of human existence by creating life. I think that the way that those ambitions played out in corrupting him were essential to his own descent into monsterhood and his monsters. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all stems from a need for control. Like, whether it's ambition in Victor Frankenstein or how the monster controlled him. Since the beginning, Victor Frankenstein, he was led on purely by ambition. To create and produce in this reanimation science. He wanted to create more. And in this sense, he was fully devoted to that purpose. And in the same way, later on, the monster controlled him. The monster was the one who led him on, wanted him to create the female mate for him. And in that sense, he was never fully free from his ambition. And I think that's an interesting commentary by Shelley on how this need for ambition kind of controls us and can corrupt us into being a monster. Victor Frankenstein, the exact opposite of a monster in traditional senses. When you look at him on the surface, upper middle class or upper class person, just perfectly normal on the outside, not a physical abomination like the monster. How he was truly the monster in the end, the way he got corrupted. So
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Ahan. And I think, what Victor Frankenstein kind of reminds me of is Icarus and how he flew too close to the sun and fell. I think that perfectly demonstrates Victor's journey to creating the monster. And kind of how his ambition kind of led to his fall, essentially. Mm-hmm. And I even, going back to, one thing that we learned about, previously about allegory of the cave. I think that, his ambition, in some sense, is, forcing him to see the shadows and not really being able to go to the light. He's really just confined, and his ambition is kind of the one that's driving him to not see what's actually physically in front of him.
I really like that parallel too, because especially later on in the novel, the motif of light is very much used throughout. When he was on that gloomy island by himself, and he was in prison, he was physically in prison and mentally in prison. He wasn't able to see the light. And the same way he was in his lab creating the monsters. It's just it was absent from the light. So
I think that also ties into another factor that I think is contributing to the monster phenomenon, which is the subject of heroism, and specifically how Victor Frankenstein is what we might consider as an anti-hero or Byronic hero. A traditional hero would be someone who goes out and is willing to sacrifice themselves for some greater good, to bear the world for what they see as the light at the end of the tunnel. So that makes me think of how can we weigh the value of what we can gain as heroes, of the goals that we try to aim for in the pursuit of heroism, with the suffering and the destruction we can cause by trying to seek those ambitions in the first place.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Mateo. I think that really connects to the question of, do the ends justify the means? And I don't think there's necessarily a proper way to justify the impact if that heroism does lead to something good in the end. But I do think that Mary Shelley is making a commentary on the fact that if your means are poor, if you're purely strung on by ambition and corruption, that there is an inevitable end for you, and that's failure. So I do think that the ends don't justify the means.
But I also feel it's also Victor's past that's really kind of motivating his goals. I think that's a fair point to bring up. For example, his mother passed, and he was very distraught by that, and I think that really influenced a lot of his ambitions in the future.
And I think the fact that is some justification at some level is kind of the final consolation that Shelley offers, that, as human beings, we're all trying to strive for the sublime. We're trying to strike the balance between the evil that we know we can inflict upon the world, but also the higher ideals of love and of personhood and creation that we aspire towards.
Yeah, I think the points about heroism are really interesting, but I do want to delve into what exactly creates a monster. So not in just the sense in Frankenstein, but kind of just how do circumstances affect us in general. When he attacked William and he attacked Henry Clerval, he used murder as a means to an end. He grew up with this conception of violence from the moment he left Victor Frankenstein, and he was shaped by these experiences. So I think it's really interesting how we are able to push the blame completely for someone's monstrous actions on the monster without necessarily considering the circumstances that came behind them. Because one could definitely argue that the humans were the monster in that case to Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I feel like even for example, William, that it comes to mind, he called the monster an ogre. And I think that's just it just keeps
Perpetuates the cycle.
Yeah, it keeps perpetuating the cycle that leads to the monster deteriorating in some sense. And I think even in modern society, we as a society, we reject so many people just because they're others. For example, take homelessness or immigrants. We often kind of reject them, and when in reality they add so much diversity and so much value to our society. So I feel if we just keep rejecting those people just because they're different and they don't have the exact same opinions as us, we kind of are the monsters in that sense. And I think that really ties into Mary Shelley's argument as a whole.
I do think she's also arguing that we're all victims of our circumstance. The same way Victor was a victim to his own ambition in his pursuit in the natural sciences. And the same way the Frankenstein's monster was a victim to the violent circumstances that he was endowed with, and the abandonment that he had. And I wonder if you guys have any perspectives on the ideas of victimhood and being a monster.
Well, I think that the fact that, in a sense, because we're all victims, we all have monstrous tendencies, ties into the greater goals that Shelley has for the novel. That in the pursuits that make us monstrous, in seeking love and seeking the ambitions that we have to find the balance that preserves both our humanity and the humanity of those around us.
Yeah, for sure. I really think that Mary Shelley's really arguing that we tend to condemn anything that we view as unnatural before we actually seek their story and we actually get to know them. Because an appearance is in some sense very arbitrary and artificial, just kind of a human construct. But we need to really go into the more intangibles, what they're really like as a human, instead of outright rejecting them.
Yeah, so in a sense, Victor Frankenstein and his ambition kind of led him down a destructive path when he was aiming for greatness. And I'm kind of thinking, as a society and as individual humans, should we be aiming for greatness? And are there limits to that greatness that we should aim for?
I think that if we really keep the motivations that we have, the goodness that we want to achieve in the forefront of our mind, I think that always aspiring for greatness is what we're supposed to do. I mean, even the Christian tradition, at least, is all about never stopping. That if you ever stop, you're really going backwards. That only way to get to the goals, to the higher parts of life, is to keep trying and to keep... Yeah, we can just say keep trying.
Yeah, I do think it's a slippery slope, though, you know? Especially when you're isolated and you don't really know you're isolated. Any one of us could kind of fall into a similar trap that Victor did without really realizing it. And I think it's important to recognize that while we should all aspire to be great, we need to keep our morals in check. We need to make sure all of our actions are based on our morals.
Yeah, and then also an important thing, like taking responsibility for your actions. And as Ahan said, really keeping track of your morals. Like, for example, like Victor was completely guided by his selfishness and his hubris. So I think definitely keeping that in check is a very important preliminary to aspiring towards greatness.
And maybe we do it with other people too. We stay connected, unlike Victor Frankenstein and unlike the Victorian Society recommended us to. We stay connected with the people around us, and we love them not just as objects for our pleasure or as people who can give us friendship, but as true companions who can teach us and who can keep us on the straight and narrow way.
I definitely agree. Yeah, thanks for coming on, guys, to this Frankenstein podcast. It was nice having you.
Yeah, it was really fun. So
I threw! I'm so sad!
Wait, the other one is still going.
Oh, fuck!
We're keeping that in.